The Grand Assembly Hall of the Vorathian Empire stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian floor, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into artificial stars. 27 species had gathered for the Accord Summit, their delegates arranged in precise hierarchical order, according to their civilization's age and military strength. The humans, as always, occupied the furthest ring, newcomers barely 2 centuries into interstellar politics. Elara Soren stood at the speaker's podium, her small frame dwarfed by the holographic projection that magnified her image across the hall. She had been speaking for 17 minutes about resource distribution in contested sectors, her voice steady despite the weight of representing her entire species. The older civilizations listened with barely concealed condescension. Humans were persistent, they'd give them that, but ultimately irrelevant in the grand calculus of empire. Then, mid-sentence, Elara's words slurred. Her hand reached for the podium's edge, fingers grasping at nothing. The projection flickered as she crumpled, her body folding like paper before hitting the platform with a sound that shouldn't have carried but somehow echoed through the vast chamber. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. The assembled diplomats exchanged glances. Was this some sort of primitive human theatrical gesture? The Vorathian Prime Chancellor raised one crystalline appendage to signal the guards to remove the disruption and continue with the schedule. That's when Rune howled. The cub was barely 6 solar cycles old, part of the Lixian delegation that sat in the middle, rings a species of lupine warriors whose pups were brought to assemblies to learn statecraft from infancy. Rune's howl started low, a mournful sound that built into something primal and devastating. It was a death song, a mourning cry that every predator species in the galaxy recognized at an instinctual level. The sound hit the other Lixian cubs first. Within seconds, 7 more voices joined Rune's, their collective grief tearing through the political decorum like claws through silk. The adult Lixians stood frozen, torn between protocol and instinct, as their young mourned a fallen stranger. Then the Krenathi hatchlings began clicking their mandibles in distress. The Theran younglings' scales flushed deep purple, their species' color of sorrow. Across the assembly, every juvenile present reacted to Elara's collapse with immediate, visceral emotion, their cries forming a cacophony that drowned out all attempts at order. The Prime Chancellor's commands went unheard. The guards hesitated, unwilling to use force with so many influential offspring present. And still, the cubs howled, their voices carrying something the adults had forgotten: pure, unfiltered empathy. Elara's assistant, Marcus, had already vaulted over 3 rows of seats to reach her. His hands shook as he checked her pulse, relief flooding his face when he found it weak, but present. "Medical emergency," he shouted, though his voice was nothing against the wall of sound from the young ones. The Lixian matriarch, Commander Sira, was the first adult to move. She stepped away from her delegation's position and walked directly to the human platform. Protocol be damned. Her massive form knelt beside Elara's still body, and she placed one clawed hand gently on the human's shoulder. The gesture was clear. "I witness. I acknowledge. You matter." One by one, other species representatives began to move. The Theran ambassador slithered forward with medical equipment. The Krenathi hive speaker's drones formed a protective perimeter. Even the ancient Valdorians, who hadn't shown emotion in recorded history, shifted their crystalline forms into patterns of concern. The assembly had ground to a complete halt. Millennia of diplomatic procedure meant nothing in the face of a single human's collapse, and the raw, honest grief of children who had never learned to hide what they felt. It took 18 minutes for the medical team to stabilize Elara, a neural feedback loop from her translator implant, they determined, caused by attempting to process too many simultaneous diplomatic channels while exhausted. 18 minutes during which the entire galactic assembly waited in silence, after Syra had gently quieted the cubs with a gesture that promised them the fallen would be tended. When Elara's eyes finally fluttered open, the first thing she saw was Rune's face. The small Lixian cub had been allowed to approach, his golden eyes wet with tears he didn't understand. "You came back?" he whispered in halting galactic common, his voice hoarse from howling. Elara managed a weak smile, her hand rising to touch the cub's soft fur. "I'm okay, little one. Thank you for caring." The Prime Chancellor stood at last, his usual imperious tone noticeably subdued. The assembly is suspended for 3 solar cycles. When we reconvene, the human delegation will speak first, and we will listen without interruption until they are finished standing or fallen. It wasn't the Cubs' continued presence that changed the Chancellor's mind. It wasn't even the diplomatic disaster of having ignored a medical emergency. It was the simple, devastating realization that the galaxy's children had shown more humanity than its leaders. The young ones had seen a person collapse and responded with immediate compassion, while the adults had seen a political inconvenience. The humans called their young, the future. Perhaps, the ancient species realized with uncomfortable clarity, they had spent too long forgetting what that meant. As medical personnel carefully transported Alara from the hall, every delegate stood a courtesy normally reserved only for founding species. But Rune and the other Cubs had taught them something that day. That empathy was not weakness. That caring was not primitive. And that sometimes, the youngest souls understand what the oldest minds forget. In the human section, someone began to clap. Then another. Soon the entire assembly resonated with the sound. 27 species, centuries and light years apart in evolution, united in a simple acknowledgement that they had witnessed something important. Alara Soren would recover fully. Her speech would be remembered not for its content, but for what happened after she fell. And in the years to come, when diplomats grew cold and political, when ancient grudges threatened new conflicts, someone would always remember to ask, what would the Cubs do? Usually, the answer was simple. They would howl. They would care. They would compel even an empire to halt. To witness. To remember that beneath all the politics and power, there were just people fallible, mortal, and worth mourning. And sometimes, that made all the difference.